Good evening, everybody. This is Arlington-Fairfax DAV Chapter 10, and this is our second installment of our online benefits information series. And this evening, Wednesday, May 22nd, we are going to be discussing survivors' benefits, specifically DIC, non-service-connected death pension, and some ancillary benefits, as well as some tips on how to be prepared and think about things toward the future. So, before we get underway, my name is Shane Lehrman. I am the adjutant of Chapter 10, as well as a DAV National Service Officer and professional staff part of DAV. I've been in this business for nearly 21 years, so I have a lot of experience within VA regional offices, our office at the Board of Veterans Appeals, and on our national service staff as well. And I would like to introduce everyone to Chapter 10's commander, Tom Wendell.
Good evening, everybody. I'm glad everybody could join us tonight, and I hope that you're able to bring your significant others with you to this training because it will be very beneficial to them as well. And we look forward to continuing this training, and we hope that you get a lot out of it. And please let us know your thoughts, afterwards, what you think of the training so we can, make it better in the future. And Shane, I appreciate everything you're doing, and it's all you, brother.
Thanks, Tom. For those of you who don't know, not only is Tom Wendell our Chapter 10 commander, Tom has been doing this nearly 20 years himself as a professional for DAV, as a National Service Officer, National Area Supervisor, and Tom is currently the Assistant Supervisor of DAV's National Appeals Office at the Board of Veterans Appeals in DC. So we have a lot of experience available just for you this evening in this training. So let's go ahead and get underway. So within the VA system, there are two different monthly benefits that are available to surviving spouses. And those two different benefits are Dependents Indemnity Compensation, which is a mouthful, which is why we affectionately refer to it as DIC. The other benefit that is available is Non-Service-Connected Survivors Pension. Now, the reason we're trying to make sure everybody understands this information is once the veteran passes, a lot of times that monthly compensation the veteran was receiving will be sorely missed as part of the household income. We want to educate veterans and their spouses to understand that once the veteran passes, their monthly compensation will stop. And then these are the two benefits that will be available to the surviving spouse. These are both monthly payments. One is DIC, and the other is Non-Service-Connected Survivors Pension. So our agenda this evening, we are going to discuss DIC and all of the different ways to qualify for it. We're also going to talk about Non-Service-Connected Survivors Pension, the eligibility requirements. And we are also going to briefly talk about a few of the ancillary benefits that are available for a service-connected cause of death. And those are going to be Dependents Educational Assistance, or Chapter 35, and CHAMP VA. Then we're also going to talk briefly about how to be prepared and how to be in the event of the veteran's death, how your surviving spouse or your spouse can get prepared and be ready now and in the future. So that's what we're going to be talking about this evening. And let's get right into it. So you might be thinking to yourself, what is Dependents Indemnity Compensation, or affectionately referred to as DIC? Well, I'm glad you asked, because DIC is a tax-free monthly monetary benefit paid to eligible survivors of military service members who died in the line of duty, or eligible survivors of veterans whose death resulted from a service-connected injury or disease. So essentially, DIC is a tax-free monthly benefit based on a disability or death that is related to a service-connected disability. And the compensation is not based on any other factors except it's a flat monthly amount. So the current monthly amount as of effective December 1st, 2018 for DIC, the basic monthly rate, is $1,318.04. So it's also clear to point out, or important to note, that the DIC amount that is paid has nothing to do with the percentage or the amount of benefits the veteran was receiving. DIC is this flat amount of $1,319, and if there are any dependent children under the age of 18, you would add $326 a month to that amount. And here's what they refer to as the DIC kicker. If a veteran was 100% disabled for 8 years prior to death, you will add an additional $280 to that current amount of $1,319. So essentially, it'll take you close to $1,600 if the veteran was 100% 8 years prior to their passing. So now that we've talked about what it is and how much it can pay out and the benefit is a month, you might be thinking to yourself, hey, how can DIC be granted? Well, I'm glad you asked, because there are two ways to establish entitlement to DIC. Those are, one, a service-connected cause of death, or the other way is what we refer to as a statutory entitlement. And I know you might be thinking, how does that work? Well, we're going to let you know. The definitions and requirements for service-connected cause of death, which is what we're going to talk about first when it comes to DIC. All of that information can be found, if you're curious, in 38 CFR, that's 38 of the Code of Federal Regulations, 3.312. So the information we're about to relay can all be found in 38 CFR 3.312. So in order to get DIC based on a service-connected cause of death, there are two things to remember. It can be established, one, by the primary cause of death, and that is, if the service-connected disability, it will be considered as a principal or primary cause of death when that disability, singly or jointly with some other condition, was the immediate or underlying cause of death or was etiologically related thereto. Well, what does all that regulatory language mean? It means, let's say a veteran is service-connected for coronary artery disease. His cause of death listed on his death certificate is coronary artery disease. It's pretty safe to say that was his primary cause of death, and the VA can determine that it's a service-connected cause of death, as the principal cause of death was directly related to a service-connected disability. So when we're talking about service connection for cause of death, there are two things to make sure we consider. We just talked about the primary cause of death. Now let's talk about a contributory cause of death. So service connected for cause of death, it can either be the service connected disability can be the primary cause or a contributory cause. In determining whether the service connected disability contributed to death, it must be shown that it contributed substantially or materially, that it combined to cause death, that it aided or lent assistance to the production of death. So let's say that the underlying cause of death, for example, might be an infection. But we know that the veteran is service-connected for the removal of the spleen due to a combat injury. We can argue that the spleen, since it no longer is there, it can no longer assist the body in fighting off an infection. So when the veteran got his infection, it caused his death because his service-connected lack of spleen couldn't help him fight it off, and it can be determined that it contributed substantially or materially and combined to cause death. So that's just one example of how a service-connected condition, while not considered the primary cause of death, can still be considered as a service-connected cause of death if we can establish it was a contributory cause. There's a few other ways to do that. I'm not going to get into all of that detail, but the important thing to remember when we talk about DIC, It can be granted by service-connected cause of death, and when we talk about service-connected cause of death, we need to think about the primary or contributing cause of death being a service-connected disability. So some of the examples I just gave for a primary cause of death could be, for example, lung cancer, and the veteran was in Vietnam and exposed to Agent Orange. We can establish that his cause of death for the lung cancer can be related to his service-connected exposure to Agent Orange and be the primary cause of death. Another example of a contributing cause of death could be if the veteran died of coronary artery disease but was service-connected for hypertension and not coronary artery disease. We can make the link that the hypertension went and assisted in the production of death by helping to be an underlying cause or contributing cause to the veteran's death from his service-connected or due to his heart condition. So, Tom, did you have any additional examples or discussion you wanted to provide in reference to the service-connected cause of death?
Sure. One of the things I wanted to point out to people is the example you use as far as lung cancer related to exposure to Agent Orange. One thing you have to keep in mind is there are some veterans that never filed a claim in their lifetime, but if they died of a presumptive condition like lung cancer related to Agent Orange, even though that veteran never filed a claim, the spouse can still file for DIC based off of a service-connected death. So just something to point out there, but very good.
Thanks, Tom. So important thing to remember for DIC, you can either get it for a service-connected cause of death, and as we established, there's two different ways you can essentially establish that, and that is by a service-connected disability being the primary cause of death or a service-connected disability being a contributory cause of death. So when we talk about dependents indemnity compensation or DIC, you can either establish it by a cause of death or you can establish it by a statutory entitlement. And that's what we're going to talk about next. So just if you're interested, the next section we're going to talk about is statutory entitlement to DIC. All of the information we're about to discuss on the three different statutory entitlements can all be found in Title 38, the United States Code 1318. So this is going to be a statutory provision. Previously, it was a regulatory provision. So 1318 provides us with three different ways to get a statutory entitlement to DIC. And that is what a lot of people like to refer to as the 10-year rule. It says that if the veteran was rated as totally disabling, 100% to include if he was had a total disability evaluation based on individual unemployability or TDIU or IU. If they were 100% for a period of 10 consecutive years prior to death, regardless of the cause of death but not due to willful misconduct, DIC can be established. So under the statutory entitlements, let's say the veteran was a 100% service-connected for a psychiatric disorder for 11 consecutive years and is in a car accident, not due to their own willful misconduct, and unfortunately dies due to the severity of their injuries from a car accident. The surviving spouse would be entitled to DIC because the veteran was rated for 100% for at least 10 consecutive years prior to the death, regardless of the cause, as long as it's not due to willful misconduct. So when you hear a lot of people talk about the 10-year rule, this is what it means. If you were 100% for 10 consecutive years prior to death, regardless of how the veteran's cause of death is established, the surviving spouse can still be entitled based on the 10-year rule. So under the statutory entitlement, we have the 10-year rule and we have the 5-year rule. The 5-year rule is very specific. If the veteran was rated as totally disabling, 100%, including individual unemployability for a period of 5 consecutive years prior to death from the date of the veteran's discharge or release from active duty. So let's say the veteran gets released from active duty and establishes a 100% evaluation back to the date they're discharged. If they're 100% for 5 consecutive years from the date of discharge, no matter what their death is due to, the surviving spouse will be able to get entitlement to DIC based on the statutory provision. So we have the 10-year rule. The 5-year rule is much more specific. It has to be 5 years of 100% from the date of discharge or separation from service. And the third statutory entitlement to DIC is based on 1 year. So the veteran was a former POW and rated as totally disabling 100%, including IU, for a period of 1 year prior to death. So we have the 10-year rule for all veterans, 100% 10 years prior to death. We have the 5-year rule, which is 5 years prior to death from the date of separation from active military service. Then we have the 1 year rule for former POWs. As long as they're 100% 1 year prior to death, their surviving spouse will get entitlement to DIC based on this statutory provision. So, as we've established, there's DIC. There's 2 ways to get it. You can get DIC based on service-connected cause of death or on statutory entitlement, and the 3 that we have just discussed. So a few examples, we just kind of talked through a couple. If the veteran was 100% for at least 10 years prior to death, as long as their death's not due to willful misconduct, the surviving spouse will get entitlement to DIC. The 5-year rule has to be 5 years at 100% from the date of discharge, and a former POW has to have at least 100% for 1 year prior to death for the surviving spouse to be entitled. So, does anybody have any questions on the statutory provisions? Or Tom, is there anything you would like to add?
Not as far as the statutory provisions. They're pretty much self-explanatory.
Outstanding. Thanks, Tom. So again, when we talk about the 2 benefits available to surviving spouses, we have DIC and what we're going to talk about shortly, which is the non-service-connected survivors pension. But for DIC, there's 2 different ways to get it: cause of death or statutory entitlements. So that's where we've got up to this point. And there's one last thing I would like to mention. For a lot of you who have retired from active military service, you may have been opted into, or you yourself decided to purchase what's called the Survivor's Benefit Plan, or SBP. I want to talk about this because this is important to know when we start talking about DIC. Survivor's Benefit Plan is a Department of Defense program that the retiree pays into monthly. This is just like an insurance program. So the Survivor's Benefit Plan, or SBP, is essentially an insurance program through the Department of Defense that the retired active duty or service member pays into on a monthly basis, with the understanding that when they pass, their beneficiary is going to get a monthly check based on the Survivor's Benefit Program, or the Survivor's Benefit Plan. Now, as we've established, DIC is due to a service-connected cause of death or the statutory entitlement, which has absolutely nothing to do with the DoD insurance program. The reason I want to make sure everybody understands this is there's currently a dollar-for-dollar offset between the Survivor's Benefit Plan and DIC. So, for example, let's say that the retiree purchases the Survivor's Benefit Plan at separation from service, pays into it monthly, passes away. The surviving spouse, noted as the beneficiary, will get that monthly check. Let's say that monthly check is $1,500 a month. The Survivor's Benefit Plan is taxable. The surviving spouse then files a claim for DIC for the service-connected cause of death. It gets granted, and it's currently at $1,300 a month. So there will be a dollar for dollar offset. The surviving spouse will not be allowed to receive both the survivor's benefit plan and the DIC. There'll be a dollar for dollar offset. If the survivor's benefit plan is greater, the remaining amount will be taxable upon the surviving spouse. Now, I bring this up because spouses need to be aware of this because of that offset. So in the eventuality when the veteran passes away, they need to understand if they do have the survivor's benefit plan, there's an offset with DIC. Now, just to throw another wrench into the works and talk about this for a second, and that is there's current legislation that is pending to do away with this offset. So they are trying to get this changed within Congress. They've been trying for the last several years, actually, to eliminate that dollar for dollar offset for those who receive the survivor's benefit plan and the DIC. So I would not suggest currently that if you're a retiree receiving the survivor's benefit plan and you're already 100% for 10 consecutive years, I would not get rid of the survivor's benefit plan so your spouse can get just the DIC. Given the fact that there is legislation and there is the potential that offset could be removed, if you're currently receiving the survivor's benefit plan and you're already at 100% for 10 years, I would let it ride until we determine what this legislation is going to do, because your spouse may be able in the near future to receive both. Anybody have any questions on DIC and the offsets with the survivor's benefits plan?
Just something, Shane, as far as right now with the legislation that's pending, everyone should be reaching out to their congressmen and their senators in reference to this legislation and making your voices heard. It's very important to do that now because there's a big push now for it. So this is the time. Thank you.
You're welcome, Tom. He brings up a very good point. If you want to learn more about that pending legislation, go to DAV's Commanders Action Network or davcan.org. You can search our current legislative campaigns, and you will find that bill in there, and you can go in there and contact your representative in reference to why it's important that they eliminate the offset between DIC and the survivor's benefits plan. So now that we know about DIC, and it can be based on a service-connected death or statutory entitlement, let's talk about the other benefit that's available to a surviving spouse, and that is non-service-connected survivor's pension. So as we established at the beginning, surviving spouse has two options. It's either the DIC or now we're going to discuss non-service-connected survivor's pension. So you might be thinking to yourself, what is non-service-connected survivor's pension? Well, I think we've got that figured out. It is a plan, the survivor's pension benefit, which may also be referred to as death pension, and it is also a tax-free monetary benefit payable to a low-income, unremarried surviving spouse and or unmarried child or children of a deceased veteran with wartime service. That may sound a little confusing, so let's take it a step further, and that is, when we start talking about this, again, it is a tax-free benefit, but this is going to be based on a few other eligibility requirements. So one of the first things we have to consider is the deceased veteran must have met the following requirements, and that is, for service on or before September 7th, 1980, the veteran must have served at least 90 days of active military service with at least 1 day during a wartime period. Notice we didn't say in combat, they just had to serve during an established wartime period. Now, for veterans who served after September 7th, 1980, the veteran must have served at least 24 months or the full period for which they were enlisted or called or ordered to active duty, with at least 1 day being during a wartime period. So again, not combat, just 1 day during a period of war. So and obviously in both of these, they must have an honorable discharge. and non-service connected survivor's pension, it's also based on countable income. So when it talked about must be low income, non-service connected survivor's pension is based on income, and they're going to count everything. To the VA, all income is counted to include Social Security. So if a surviving spouse is receiving Social Security every month, the VA is going to consider that as income. Now, the current annual amount maximum is $7,309. So if a surviving spouse is making more than $7,300 a year to include Social Security, they're going to have too high an income for non-service connected survivor's pension. But what they will also do is the income and assets that we have just established in the maximum amount, that can be offset with unreimbursed medical expenses. For example, if the surviving spouse has $8,000 a year in income, but $20,000 a year in unreimbursed medical expenses, that can offset the difference and still get the surviving spouse into an entitlement in a monthly amount based on the offset between the income and the unreimbursed medical expenses. There is also two other programs a surviving spouse may be eligible for. One is if their disabilities are so severe and require them to be entitled to aid and attendance, or if they're statutory housebound, they can't leave their home. Those are higher levels of non-service connected survivor's pension, and that can raise the limit of income as well. So there are a few other ways to look at the eligibility criteria based on income. If we have the unreimbursed medical expenses, that can help offset, or if they're entitled to a higher level of benefit based on aid and attendance or based on housebound status. So now that we've talked about non-service connected survivor's pension, here's really the nuts and bolts. As long as the veteran had active duty, either 90 days or 90 consecutive days or 24 months, with one day being during a period of war, and the surviving spouse's income is less than $7,300 annually, the surviving spouse can be entitled to non-service connected survivor's pension. Anybody have any basic questions? Or Tom, do you have anything you want to throw in reference to non-service connected survivor's pension?
Sure, Shane. What you see most of the time with non-service connected death pension is majority of the spouses, once they're on Social Security, they normally don't qualify for this program until they get to the point where they're in need of aid and attendance or housebound, to where they're in a nursing home or home health care, where we can use those medical expenses to reduce their household income. So just because a spouse isn't eligible when they first apply, it's not something you should just say they're never going to qualify, because circumstances change and the medical expenses is something that can definitely change the outcome of this. So just be aware of it. You know, unfortunately, it is a low income program, but it's a program that's at least out there for those that really need it. So thank you, Shane.
No problem, Tom. Thank you. And he points something out, that circumstances can change when it comes to the severity of even the health of the surviving spouse, which can help them get the entitlement to non-service connected death pension when their own disabilities and own unreimbursed medical expenses are extremely high. So Tom makes a good point. Those are things to consider. And as part of the income-based part of non-service connected death pension, those who receive it are required to report all of their income annually, and the VA will do a cross-match check as well, and they'll get information from IRS as well as from Social Security to verify the amount of income since this is an income-based program. So I know you might be thinking to yourself out there, Tom, can you receive both DIC and non-service-connected survivor's pension at the same time? Well, the answer to that is no, you cannot. You can only receive one of the benefits. Now, in most cases, DIC will be the better benefit as it is not income-based. So when you're talking about which benefit is better, generally it's going to be DIC. Because as we've established, and Tom helped explain, the survivor's pension is based on income, where DIC is not. So that brings us up to one of the other topics of this evening from our agenda. We talked about DIC, we talked about non-service-connected survivor's pension or death pension. Now we're going to just touch on a few ancillary benefits that are related to a service-connected cause of death. So let's say the surviving spouse is getting DIC based on service-connected cause of death. They would be entitled to dependents' educational assistance, something we refer to as either DEA or even Chapter 35. So this provides education and training to dependents of veterans who are permanently and totally disabled with a VA rating of 100% or who died as a result of a service-related condition. So dependents' educational assistance can also be granted to veterans currently who are 100% permanently and totally disabled, but it can also be granted if a service-connected for cause of death has been established. DEA will be granted and be eligible for the surviving spouse and any dependent children. Dependents' educational assistance works like the old Montgomery GI Bill does, and that is once they're enrolled in school or an approved course of training, they will pay X amount of dollars a month to the beneficiary while they're going to school. So dependents' educational assistance won't pay specifically to the college. It'll be paid to the beneficiary, and they will use that to help pay for their college. So if it's a service-connected cause of death, dependents' educational assistance or Chapter 35 will be established for the surviving spouse and any dependent children. One of the other important ancillary benefits to be aware of is what's called CHAMP VA, and that stands for the Civilian Health and Medical Program of the Department of Veterans Affairs. CHAMP VA is a comprehensive healthcare benefits program in which the VA shares the cost of covered healthcare services and supplies with eligible beneficiaries. So eligible beneficiaries for CHAMP VA are spouses and dependent children. So similar to what we were just talking about in reference to dependents' educational assistance, eligibility is based on the veteran being permanently and totally disabled with a VA rating of 100%, or it was established prior to the death, and eligibility can be based on at the time of death as well. So if a veteran is awarded CHAMP VA entitlement to it prior to his death, the spouse and dependent children are eligible, but also if it's a service-connected cause of death, CHAMP VA will be eligible for the surviving spouse and the eligible children if it's based on a service-connected cause of death. So those are two important ancillary benefits to keep in mind, and that is dependents' educational assistance and CHAMP VA that are entitlements that can be established based on a service-connected cause of death. So those were going to be the two ancillary benefits that we were going to discuss this evening. There are so many other benefits we could include, but we wanted to just touch on some of those that are directly related to the DIC and the service-connected cause of death, that being dependents' educational assistance and CHAMP VA. Anybody have any questions about either of those two ancillary benefits? Or Tom, is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, I think I'm good on those, Shane. Thank you.
And Tom, thank you, sir. All right, so let's talk about a few tips for being prepared for survivors' benefits. The first thing to really make sure that you're ready is being informed about the additional benefits and requirements out there. And that's what we try to help establish with you this evening, is being informed on the different benefits that are available. Section part of that is actually being prepared. So here's an important thing to remember. DAV National Service Officers can represent survivors in their claims for benefits. So just like we can assist our fellow veterans in their disability claims, we can also provide representation for surviving spouses in their claims for their benefits, whether it's for DIC or non-service-connected survivor's pension or any of the ancillary benefits. So I would strongly suggest that you have contact information for a DAV service officer tucked away somewhere for your spouse so they know who to contact in the case of your passing, and they should also keep other information with contact information for a DAV service officer. And the other things you should make sure you have all together is a copy of the Veterans DD 214 for discharge. So make sure you have a certified copy of that available, along with contact information for the DAV. It would also be extremely helpful if you had a copy of the last VA rating decision, a list of all service-connected disabilities, which you can get from the VA with all of the percentages. And it would be also useful to have a copy of the service medical records, a copy of the service personnel records, and any VA or DOD insurance programs and numbers. Now, not everybody's going to be able to have a copy of the service medical records or personnel records. Not always going to be needed either if the veteran has already established disability claims prior to their death. These are just some additional things that if you have them, make sure you know where they are. Make sure your spouse understands the difference between the programs we talked about tonight, but also that they have contact information for a service officer for assistance. They have a copy of the DD 214, as well as your VA rating decision, list of disabilities, medical records, personnel records, and any insurance programs and numbers. So if you are purchasing the RH insurance program through the VA, make sure they're aware of those insurance numbers so that they can get the information for the insurance squared away upon your death. Just remember, you want to try to put your surviving spouse in the best possible situation. So we recommend you safeguard these documents either at home, or if you already have a safe deposit box, put all this information together so that your spouse has one location to go to, they know where everything is, and keep it all together. It just makes it much more easy and less stressful on your surviving spouse, because when and if you pass before them, they're going to be dealing with so many things all at that time. So if you can make it as simple as possible for them to try to get establishment and entitlement to VA benefits, the easier you're going to make the process on them. Now, another easy way to make it less stressful on your surviving spouse is to have them contact a DAV National Service Officer, or quite frankly, any service officer out there that can help them provide them assistance, as it'll just make the process much simpler for them. And that's kind of what we're after. So that we talked about being prepared. You can keep a list of all of those documents together. Make sure your spouse knows. One of the first things my wife and I, when we got married and moved in together, is I went through all of these documents with her. I made sure she saw each of them. She knew what they were. She knew what they meant. And we have all of that information together in one location, along with a business card for DAV, so that if anything happens to me, she knows what to do, who to call, and what information to have. Another part of that being prepared, and we're going to discuss in an upcoming online benefit information series, we're going to talk about burial benefits, and how recently the VA allowed you to start pre-planning for those, but we'll be discussing those in the future, and that is something else you can add to your list for being prepared. Veterans, just try to make it easy on your spouse. Keep everything together. Make sure they know who to contact, what information to have, the two types of benefits available, because the easier we can make it on them, it's going to be easier part of the process for them to deal with while they're coping with all the other things that come upon your passing. So now that we've talked about those issues, it brings us up to this is pretty much nearing the end of our online benefits information series tonight. So before we go do a little rundown, do a little summary of what we've discussed this evening, I just want to say thank you to everybody for attending our Survivors Benefits, DIC, Non-Service-Connected, Death Pension, and Ancillary Benefits training class we did this evening. It is being recorded. We'll have it available on our website in the near future for everybody to reference whenever they need additional information. So what we talked about tonight is essentially there are 2 monthly benefits available for surviving spouses. They are DIC, Dependents Indemnity Compensation, and Non-Service-Connected Death Pension or Non-Service-Connected Survivors Pension. So there's 2 benefits available. And in reference to DIC, there's 2 ways to establish that entitlement. Either based on a service-connected cause of death, service-connected disability either being the primary cause or a contributory cause. Or another way to establish entitlement to DIC is the statutory entitlement. What I'm going to make sure we mention is if a veteran is service-connected at 100%, to include individual unemployability, at least 10 years prior to death, the surviving spouse will meet the criteria for statutory entitlement to DIC. We then explained non-service-connected death pension or non-service-connected survivors pension and talked about the service requirements. The veteran must have had honorable service with at least 90 days of active duty, with 1 day being during a period of war prior to 1980. And after that, they must have had honorable active service 24 months, with 1 day being during a period of war. And survivor's pension or death pension is income based, and we talked about all of the requirements and eligibility involved for that. We also discussed a few ancillary benefits, dependents, educational assistance, and CHAMP VA, how those 2 programs work, and how the entitlement to both of those can be established prior to the veteran passing, but they're also part of service-connected cause of death. Those benefits will also be granted as well. And the last thing we just recently talked about was being prepared, how to make sure you've got everything put in order for your spouse to make it easier on them. So that brings us to the end of our presentation this evening. I want to thank you for bearing with us as we've gone through this, and I will go ahead and open this up to any questions anybody has about the benefits we talked about, whether it's DIC, pension, the ancillary benefits. So if anybody's got any questions, go ahead and fire away.
Hey, Shane, I got a comment before we go into questions.
Go ahead, Tom.
In reference to being prepared, one of the things you talked about was having a list of the service-connected conditions. And one of the important things with that is when the time comes and you're facing, the departure of your loved one, it's good to be able to talk to the doctors and, relate to the doctors what the veteran is indeed service-connected for. So if the doctors believe that any of those conditions contributed to the death, they can actually put it on the death certificate. Because many times we don't see those things on the death certificate, and we have to go out and get statements from a doctor later on. So if it can be placed on the death certificate, it'll definitely help everyone. Also, in reference to representing the spouse, just so the spouses know that just because we represented the veteran, we would still need a new power of attorney form to be completed for the spouse as well. So, and great training, Shane. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tom. I appreciate your help and great comments this evening. So does anybody have any questions or anything they want to talk about in reference to training that we had this evening?
Shane, this is Fred Skaggs. On one of your slides, you were listing the documents that you need to have at your fingertips. You said DD Form 214 last VA rating, and there was one more I didn't catch.
Oh, and it was something Tom just mentioned. That is a list of your service-connected disabilities and the percentage of each.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. That's great information to have because it'll make it easier, as Tom said, trying to help establish maybe a disability has been a contributing cause of death, but it'll also be helpful to the service officer of the VA when your spouse sits down and goes through and starts to file this with them. It'll be great to have that information up front to know all of the disabilities and severities that you had as a veteran, because it'll just help throughout the process.
Okay, thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks, Fred. Anybody else have any questions?
Hey Shane, this is Jesse Benahan, and I just want to thank you, Shane and Tom, for your time and effort putting in this. Very clear and much appreciated. Thank you.
Our pleasure. Thanks, Jesse. Appreciate it. And if nobody has any questions, I'm going to go ahead and once again thank you all for joining us this evening. We look forward to providing these again in the future, and hope we will have a few more classes very soon. Again, thank you all for attending tonight. And Tom, did you have any comments or anything you'd like to say in closing?
Once again, I'd like to thank everybody for attending tonight, and I hope you did indeed get some good information tonight. And when we're at our next meeting, you know, if you have questions or concerns, feel free to ask us. If you like the training, let us know. If there's something we can do to improve it, let us know. And for anyone that's on here that's not a member of Chapter 10, and we hope to see you at our next meeting. And thank you very much, Shane.
All right. Thank you, Tom. Appreciate your help and assistance and support this evening. Thank all of you. And with that, that wraps up our second installment of DAV Arlington-Fairfax Chapter 10's online benefit information series. Hopefully we'll have another one next month, and we'll get all of the information out to you. And until then, thanks, and we hope to see you at an upcoming chapter meeting or event. Good night, everybody.